The Cold War is commonly remembered as a conflict that never happened. Two superpowers stared at each other across ideological lines, built weapons they promised never to use, and eventually walked away when one side collapsed economically. The narrative presented in textbooks suggests restraint, diplomatic maneuvering, and the occasional tense moment diffused by rational leadership. But this version of history is a reconstruction built for public comfort. The Cold War was not a period of peace interrupted by proxy battles. It was a continuous operational state in which both the United States and the Soviet Union functioned under the assumption that total annihilation could begin without warning, and more importantly, without intention. The systems designed to prevent war were the same systems that brought humanity within seconds of extinction, not once, but repeatedly. And those systems were never dismantled. They were upgraded. On the night of November 24, 1961, every Strategic Air Command base in the United States received an encrypted message that brought bomber crews to their aircraft and missile officers to their launch consoles. The alert level had been raised to DEFCON 2, one step below nuclear war. The only other time this designation was used was during the Cuban Missile Crisis the following year. But in November of 1961, there was no public crisis. No Soviet ships heading toward Cuba. No tanks rolling into Berlin. The alert was triggered by a malfunction in the communication relay at Thule Air Base in Greenland. A training tape had been mistakenly inserted into a live system simulating a massive Soviet missile launch. Officers interpreting the data believed they were watching the beginning of World War III. Bomber crews started engines. Missile silos went into pre-launch sequences. The alert was only cancelled when a phone call was manually placed to NORAD headquarters to verify the launch detection. The phone line had not been destroyed, which meant the United States had not been attacked. That single phone call, placed by an officer acting outside automated procedure, stopped a retaliatory strike. There was no investigation made public. The incident remained classified for decades. The systems that allowed a training tape to trigger a nuclear alert were not replaced. They were recalibrated. In 1962, a Soviet submarine designated B-59 was surrounded by United States Navy destroyers near Cuba during the blockade. The submarine had been out of radio contact with Moscow for days. Its batteries were dying. The air inside was nearly unbreathable. The temperature inside the hull exceeded 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The captain had no way of knowing whether war had already started. American destroyers began dropping practice depth charges to force the submarine to surface. The crew of B-59 interpreted the explosions as an attack. The submarine was armed with a nuclear-tipped torpedo. Soviet protocol allowed the captain to launch it without approval from Moscow if the submarine was under direct threat and communication had been lost. Two of the three officers required to authorize the launch agreed to fire. The third officer, Vasily Arkhipov, refused. He argued that the depth charges were signals, not attacks, and that launching a nuclear weapon without confirmation of war would guarantee their deaths and potentially the deaths of millions. The other officers eventually agreed. The submarine surfaced. The American destroyers allowed it to leave. Archipov's decision was not based on orders or doctrine. It was a judgment call made by one man in a steel tube at the bottom of the ocean, under conditions designed to eliminate judgment. He returned to the Soviet Union without recognition. The United States did not learn the details of this incident until the 1990s, after the Soviet Union had collapsed. There was no protocol change. The delegation of nuclear launch authority to submarine commanders remained in place. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction was not a deterrent designed to prevent war. It was an administrative framework that assumed war was inevitable and sought to make it uniformless. The logic was circular. If both sides knew that launching a first strike would result in their own destruction, neither side would launch. But this assumed that all decisions would be made by rational actors with complete information. It did not account for accidents, miscommunication, or technical failure, and it certainly did not account for the fact that both sides were building weapon systems that reduced human decision-making to seconds or removed it entirely. In 1960, the United States deployed the first automated early warning system capable of detecting missile launches and calculating trajectories without human input. The system was designed to provide leadership with enough time to authorize a counterstrike before incoming warheads destroyed communication infrastructure. But the system could not distinguish between a missile launch and other infrared signatures. On multiple occasions, it identified the rising sun reflecting off clouds as a Soviet ICBM attack. It flagged a training exercise as a real launch. It interpreted a flock of geese as incoming bombers. Each time, officers manually overrode the system. But each time, the override window shrank. By the late 1970s, the expected warning time for a Soviet ICBM launch had been reduced to under 6 minutes. The decision to launch a retaliatory strike had to be made faster than a human being could assess the situation. In January of 1968, a B-52 bomber carrying 4 hydrogen bombs crashed into the ice near Thule Air Base in Greenland. The aircraft had been part of a program called Operation Chrome Dome, in which nuclear-armed bombers flew continuous patrols near Soviet airspace to ensure that a first strike could not destroy America's retaliatory capability on the ground. The bomber caught fire mid-flight. The crew ejected. The aircraft impacted the ice and exploded. All 4 nuclear weapons detonated conventionally, scattering radioactive plutonium across several square miles. The bombs did not achieve nuclear yield because their safing mechanisms functioned correctly, but the contamination required months of cleanup and the removal of tons of ice and soil. The incident was publicly acknowledged, but one detail was not. One of the 4 bombs was never fully recovered. Parts of its secondary stage remain entombed beneath the ice sheet. Denmark, which governed Greenland, had an explicit policy prohibiting nuclear weapons on its territory. The United States had secretly violated this agreement for years. After the crash, Denmark demanded the flights stop. The United States quietly agreed, but Operation Chrome Dome continued in other regions until a second crash in 1968 forced the program to end. Between 1960 and 1968, there were 12 major accidents involving nuclear weapons in transport or deployment. These incidents were classified under the designation Broken Arrow. The number of minor incidents was never disclosed. The Soviet Union maintained a similar airborne alert system. In 1984, a Soviet navigation error caused a nuclear-armed bomber to drift into Norwegian airspace. NATO fighters scrambled. The Soviet aircraft turned back before interception. The incident was never made public. In 1969, a Soviet submarine carrying nuclear torpedoes sank in the Pacific Ocean after a fire broke out in the battery compartment. The wreck was located by American intelligence, and the CIA attempted to recover it in a covert operation called Project Azorian. The recovery was only partially successful. Several nuclear warheads remain on the ocean floor. Neither government disclosed the incident for decades. By the early 1980s, both the United States and the Soviet Union had developed satellite systems capable of detecting missile launches within seconds. These systems fed data directly into automated response protocols. The Soviet system, known as OCO, used infrared sensors to identify the heat signatures of rocket motors during launch. On September 26, 1983, the system reported a single ICBM launch from the United States. Then it reported 5 more. The officer on duty, Stanislav Petrov, was responsible for alerting Soviet leadership so they could authorize a retaliatory strike. He had minutes to decide. Petrov noticed inconsistencies in the data. The system reported only 5 missiles, not the hundreds that would be expected in a full-scale first strike. The satellites reported high confidence, but ground-based radar showed nothing. Petrov concluded the satellite system was malfunctioning. He reported the alerts as a false alarm. He was correct. The system had mistaken sunlight reflecting off clouds for missile exhaust. Petrov was not rewarded. He was reassigned and later retired without commendation. His decision was not documented as doctrine. The satellite system remained operational. It continued to produce false alerts. Both superpowers understood that early warning systems were fallible. But they also understood that removing human judgment from the decision-making process reduced response time. This created a paradox. The faster a system could detect and respond to an attack, the more likely it was to misinterpret data and initiate a war by mistake. The solution was not to slow down the systems, it was to build more of them. By 1985, the United States had deployed the Permissive Action Link system, which required multiple codes to arm and detonate a nuclear weapon. This was intended to prevent accidental or unauthorized launches. But the system also included a feature that allowed pre-delegation of launch authority in the event that leadership was killed or communication was severed. In practical terms, this meant that missile officers in silos, submarine commanders, and bomber pilots could be granted the authority to launch without direct presidential approval if certain conditions were met. The specific conditions were classified, but they included loss of communication with the National Command Authority and confirmation of an incoming attack through at least 2 independent sources. This meant that a nuclear war could begin because of a sensor error combined with a communication failure. The Soviet Union had a similar system, but with one significant difference. In the early 1980s, Soviet leadership began developing a fully automated retaliatory system known as perimeter, or as it was called within certain military circles, dead hand. The system was designed to ensure that even if Soviet leadership was killed in a first strike, a counterstrike would still be launched. Dead Hand used a network of sensors to detect nuclear explosions on Soviet territory. If the sensors confirmed multiple detonations and communication with leadership was lost, the system would assume that the Soviet Union was being destroyed. It would then transfer launch authority to a few low-ranking officers in a deep command bunker. If those officers confirmed the sensor data and received no orders to stand down, they could launch the entire remaining Soviet arsenal without further approval. The system was not dependent on knowing who attacked or why. It was not designed to prevent war. It was designed to guarantee revenge. Dead Hand became operational in 1985. The United States did not learn of its existence until after the Soviet Union collapsed. The system was never deactivated. Russian officials have stated that a version of it remains operational today. In November of 1983, NATO conducted a military exercise called Able Archer 83. The exercise simulated the escalation from conventional war to nuclear release. It involved realistic communication protocols, the movement of nuclear assets, and changes in alert status that mirrored the early stages of an actual conflict. Soviet intelligence had been tracking NATO exercises for years, but Able Archer was different. The radio traffic was encrypted at a higher level than usual. Nuclear command units in West Germany were brought to readiness. The timing coincided with political rhetoric from the Reagan administration that Soviet analysts interpreted as preparation for a first strike. The KGB sent an alert to Soviet leadership warning that NATO might be using the exercise as cover for a real attack. Soviet forces went to high alert. Nuclear-capable aircraft in East Germany and Poland were loaded with live warheads. Submarines moved into launch positions. The alert lasted for days. NATO was unaware that the Soviet Union believed it was about to be attacked. The exercise concluded. NATO forces stood down. Soviet forces stood down. The incident was classified by both sides. Western intelligence did not learn how close the situation had come to unraveling until a KGB defector provided details years later. The exercise format was not changed. NATO continued to conduct nuclear escalation drills using the same protocols. The Cold War created a permanent infrastructure of mistrust that operated independently of diplomacy. While leaders negotiated arms reduction treaties, military commands on both sides were refining systems that assumed negotiation was theater. The Strategic Defense Initiative, announced by President Reagan in 1983, proposed a space-based missile defense system that could intercept Soviet ICBMs during their boost phase. The technology did not exist. The physics were questionable. But the announcement had an immediate strategic effect. If the United States could deploy a shield that neutralized Soviet missiles, the doctrine of mutually assured destruction would collapse. The Soviet Union would lose its deterrent. Soviet leadership interpreted the initiative not as a defensive measure, but as preparation for a first strike. If America believed it could launch an attack and then hide behind a missile shield, it might be willing to risk war. The Soviet response was not diplomatic protest. It was the acceleration of their own weapons programs. They developed maneuvering re-entry vehicles designed to evade interception. They increased production of ICBMs. They expanded the dead hand system to ensure that even a successful American first strike would still result in Soviet retaliation. The arms race, which had been slowing due to economic pressure, resumed at full intensity. The Strategic Defense Initiative never became operational. The Soviet programs it provoked remained in place. In 1980, a maintenance worker at a Titan II missile complex in Arkansas dropped a wrench socket. The socket fell several stories and punctured the fuel tank of the missile. Kerosene 50, a hypergolic fuel, began leaking. The missile was armed with a 9-megaton thermonuclear warhead. Crews were evacuated. A small team remained to assess the situation. 8 hours after the initial puncture, the missile exploded. The blast ejected the warhead from the silo and threw it several hundred feet. One crew member was killed by the explosion. The warhead did not detonate. Its safing mechanisms prevented nuclear yield. But the explosion destroyed the silo and scattered toxic fuel across the surrounding area. The incident was publicly reported, but the Air Force did not disclose how many other Titan II silos had similar maintenance vulnerabilities. The Titan II program was retired 3 years later, not because of the explosion, but because the missiles were being replaced with more modern systems. Throughout the Cold War, both superpowers conducted nuclear tests that were presented as scientific research but functioned as demonstrations of capability. The Soviet Union detonated the largest thermonuclear device ever tested on October 30th, 1961. The Tsar bomber yielded 50 megatons, roughly 3,800 times the power of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The explosion created a fireball 5 miles wide. The mushroom cloud rose 40 miles into the atmosphere. The shockwave circled the Earth 3 times. Windows shattered hundreds of miles away. The device was designed to yield 100 megatons, but the yield was reduced because scientists calculated that the full-scale explosion might ignite the atmosphere. The bomb was too large to be delivered by any existing aircraft under combat conditions. It was not a weapon. It was a message. The United States responded by accelerating development of submarine-launched ballistic missiles, which were harder to detect and could be fired from positions close to Soviet territory, reducing warning time to under 3 minutes. The doctrine of launch on warning became official policy in both nations by the late 1970s. This meant that if early warning systems detected an incoming attack, leadership was expected to authorize a counterstrike before the enemy missiles arrived. The policy was not publicly debated. It was implemented through classified directives buried in war planning documents. The logic was straightforward. If you wait to confirm that an attack is real, your weapons will be destroyed before you can launch them. If you launch on warning, you preserve your ability to retaliate. But launching on warning also means that a sensor error or a misinterpreted signal becomes indistinguishable from an actual attack. The decision to end the world has to be made on incomplete information, under time pressure, by individuals who have trained for years to follow protocol without hesitation. In 1979, NORAD's early warning system reported a large-scale Soviet missile launch. The report triggered an alert at multiple military installations. Fighter jets were scrambled. Missile crews went to launch readiness. The alert lasted 6 minutes before it was determined to be false. The cause was identified as a training simulation that had been mistakenly fed into the live system. 3 days later, the same error occurred again. The system reported another massive Soviet launch. Crews went to alert status. The error was identified faster this time, but the system that caused it was not replaced. It was recalibrated and returned to service. Later analysis revealed that the system had produced more than 100 false alerts over a 2-year period. None of these errors were disclosed to the public. None resulted in changes to the protocols that required officers to make launch decisions within minutes. The superpowers also fought the Cold War through intelligence operations that were never intended to be acknowledged. In 1956, the CIA and British intelligence dug a tunnel under East Berlin to tap Soviet communication lines. The operation, codenamed Gold, intercepted thousands of hours of military communications before Soviet counterintelligence discovered it. The Soviet Union had known about the tunnel from the beginning. A British intelligence officer working for the KGB had informed them before construction started. The Soviets allowed the operation to continue because shutting it down would have exposed their source. Both sides extracted value from the same operation for different reasons. When the tunnel was finally revealed, both sides claimed it as a victory. In 1960, a CIA U-2 reconnaissance aircraft piloted by Francis Gary Powers was shot down over Soviet territory. Powers survived and was captured. The Eisenhower administration initially claimed the aircraft was a weather research plane that had strayed off course. The Soviets produced the wreckage, the surveillance equipment, and Powers himself, forcing the United States to admit the mission. The incident destroyed a planned summit between Eisenhower and Khrushchev. It also revealed that the United States had been conducting illegal overflights of Soviet airspace for years. The flights did not stop. They became more sophisticated. By the mid-1960s, reconnaissance satellites had replaced most manned overflights, but the underlying assumption remained. Gathering intelligence justified violations of sovereignty. The Cold War created legal frameworks that had no jurisdiction. The concept of plausible deniability became foundational to Cold War operations. If an action could not be directly attributed to a government, that government could deny responsibility while still achieving strategic goals. The Soviet Union used this doctrine extensively in Eastern Europe, supporting communist movements while claiming non-interference. The United States applied it in Latin America, Southeast Asia, and Africa, funding insurgencies, coups, and assassinations through intermediaries. In 1961, the CIA trained and equipped a paramilitary force of Cuban exiles to invade Cuba at the Bay of Pigs. The operation was intended to look like an internal uprising. The planners assumed that if the invasion faltered, President Kennedy would authorize air support. Kennedy refused. The invasion failed. The exiles were killed or captured. The United States publicly denied involvement, even as captured invaders testified to their CIA training. The denial was not intended to be believed. It was intended to be unrebutted. Plausible deniability did not require plausibility. It required only that no government would formally challenge the denial. Both superpowers also manipulated neutral nations into dependency. Economic aid, military support, and intelligence sharing were offered with implicit conditions. Countries that accepted Soviet assistance found themselves hosting military advisors and signing treaties that limited their sovereignty. Countries that accepted American assistance found themselves integrated into security architectures that required them to align with U.S. strategic interests. The Cold War was not fought only in Europe or Asia. It was fought in the voting chambers of the United Nations, in the conference rooms of international banks, in the editorial offices of newspapers that received quiet subsidies. Influence was more valuable than territory. A nation that believed it was making independent decisions while consistently aligning with one superpower's interests was more useful than a nation under direct occupation. By the 1980s, the economic cost of the Cold War was unsustainable for the Soviet Union. Military spending consumed roughly 15 to 17% of Soviet GDP, compared to 6% in the United States. The Soviet economy, centrally planned and dependent on oil exports, could not keep pace with American technological development. The decision to match American military expansion bankrupted the state. But the United States did not win the Cold War through military superiority. It won because the Soviet system collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. The Berlin Wall fell in November of 1989. The Soviet Union dissolved in December of 1991. The Cold War was declared over, but the infrastructure of the Cold War was not dismantled. Nuclear arsenals were reduced, but not eliminated. Early warning systems were maintained. Satellite networks were expanded. Submarine patrols continued. The doctrine of launch on warning remained in place. The weapons systems designed to function without human judgment were upgraded with faster processors and more sensitive sensors. Russia inherited the Soviet nuclear arsenal and the strategic doctrine that came with it. The dead hand system, designed to guarantee retaliation even if leadership was killed, remained operational. NATO, which had been created to counter the Soviet Union, did not dissolve. It expanded, incorporating former Soviet satellite states and moving closer to Russia's borders. This expansion was interpreted by Russian leadership as a continuation of Cold War containment policy under a different name. The United States continued to develop missile defense systems, now framed as protection against rogue states rather than Russia. But the strategic effect was the same. Any missile defense system that could intercept a small number of warheads could, in theory, be expanded to intercept a larger number. This created the same destabilizing dynamic that the Strategic Defense Initiative had created in the 1980s. If one side believes it can defend against retaliation, the other side assumes that a first strike is being prepared. In 2002, the United States withdrew from the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, which had limited the deployment of missile defense systems since 1972. The withdrawal was justified as necessary to counter threats from North Korea and Iran. Russia responded by developing hypersonic weapons designed to evade missile defenses. China, observing both nations, accelerated its own nuclear modernization program. The arms race, which had paused, resumed. The Cold War had not ended. It had privatized. Defense contractors continued to develop weapons systems. Intelligence agencies continued to conduct operations. Military alliances continued to expand. The ideological component had been removed, but the structural component remained. Nations still operated under the assumption that security required the ability to destroy anyone who threatened them. Trust was still considered a vulnerability. The Cold War established a template for conflict that has persisted. Adversaries do not declare war. They impose sanctions, conduct cyber attacks, fund proxy forces, and engage in strategic ambiguity. The goal is not victory. It is the preservation of leverage. Nuclear weapons are not built to be used. They are built to ensure that any conflict remains limited. But the systems that manage these weapons are still designed to operate under the assumption that a first strike is imminent. They are still configured to reduce decision-making time to minutes or seconds. They are still vulnerable to the same technical failures, communication breakdowns, and misinterpretations that nearly caused accidental nuclear war during the Cold War. The difference is that the current systems are faster, more automated, and more interconnected. A cyber attack on an early warning network could produce the same effect as a sensor malfunction. A satellite system hacked to report false data could trigger a launch protocol. The Cold War never required intention. It only required error. In 2007, a B-52 bomber flew from North Dakota to Louisiana carrying 6 nuclear-armed cruise missiles. The weapons were supposed to have been removed before the flight. They were not. The aircraft flew across the continental United States with live nuclear warheads for more than 3 hours before anyone noticed. The incident was not discovered by a safeguard or a checklist. It was discovered when a ground crew at the destination base saw warheads that were not supposed to be there. An investigation revealed that multiple failures in procedure and communication had occurred. Officers had signed documents certifying that the weapons had been removed without verifying it. The weapons were unguarded on the aircraft for more than 15 hours. No unauthorized access occurred, but the failure exposed how easily protocol could collapse. The Air Force reassigned dozens of officers. The procedures were reviewed, the weapons were secured. But the underlying system in which nuclear warheads could be lost, misplaced, or transported without proper oversight was not redesigned. Today, 9 countries possess nuclear weapons. The United States and Russia maintain approximately 90% of the global arsenal. Both nations keep a portion of their weapons on high alert, ready to launch within minutes. China, France, the United Kingdom, India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea also possess nuclear capabilities. None of these nations have renounced the doctrine of nuclear deterrence. All of them maintain some version of launch readiness. The agreements that once limited nuclear testing and deployment have either expired or been abandoned. The Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which eliminated an entire class of missiles, was terminated in 2019. The New START Treaty, which limits strategic nuclear warheads, is set to expire in 2026. There is no replacement under negotiation. The infrastructure of the Cold War remains operational because the assumptions of the Cold War were never resolved. Nations still believe that survival depends on the ability to annihilate their enemies. They still believe that peace is maintained through the threat of total destruction. And they still rely on systems that compress the decision to end human civilization into a time frame shorter than it takes to confirm whether a threat is real.